The sound came first, before anybody understood what it meant. A tray of food hitting a tile floor in a nursing home dining room, plastic cup bouncing, applesauce splattering across an old woman's slippers, and the big man standing over her, saying the words loud enough that every resident in that room heard them. You get what the contract pays for, and the contract doesn't pay for a second helping. Eleanor Coyle was 84 years old that morning, 91 pounds in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, and she had reached for a second dinner roll because she had been hungry for 3 days straight. And a man sent by the man who owned Magnolia Grove Assisted Living had walked the length of that dining hall to take it off her plate and drop her entire tray on the ground to make a point in front of 40 people who could not stand up to help her. Nobody moved. A room full of children and grandchildren of the greatest generation, aides who needed the paycheck, one visiting daughter who looked at her phone, and not one of them stood up. Eleanor just folded her hands in her lap and looked at the mess on the floor and said, "Quiet. I'm sorry." What Bryce Halloran did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he sat 2 floors up turning the watch on his wrist, was what that old woman's son had really been a long time ago, in a life the man had walked away from and folded up and put in a steel box in the back of a shop. A long time ago, there were men in 3 states who lowered their voices when the name Deacon came up in a room, men who did not lower their voices for anybody else. Almost nobody in that building that morning had the first idea what was about to roll into that parking lot, least of all the young man in the gray suit upstairs, who had already made the single most expensive mistake of his life over the cost of 1 dinner roll. Stay with me, because the part that finished Bryce Halloran didn't involve a single raised fist, and there were 62 of them in that lot before it was over, and every one of them obeyed the law to the letter. It started long before that tray ever hit the floor. Let me back all the way up, because you need to understand exactly who Ray Coyle was before you watch what the world did to the man who wronged his mother. Everybody in the county just called him Deacon, and had for so long that the young ones didn't know it was ever a road name and figured it was just what his mother named him. His mother had not named him that. He was 66 years old that autumn, gray all the way through, hair he kept short and a beard he kept shorter, and hands that had done every hard thing a pair of hands can do and had, in the last decade, mostly gone quiet. He ran a motorcycle shop on the 2-lane out past the feed store, opened it at 7 every morning, had opened it at 7 every morning for 19 years, and the smell of that place, the cutting oil and the rubber and the coffee he burned on a hot plate in the corner, was the smell half the men in that town measured their week against. Big he was, in a way that had nothing to do with size, because he wasn't a large man. He'd gone lean the way old fighters go lean. It was something in how still he held himself, the way a man holds still when he has already been everywhere loud gets you and decided against it. Quiet, mostly. But when Deacon spoke, men who could bench 300 pounds leaned in without meaning to. He'd come home from a war nobody wanted to talk about, with a box of medals he never once showed anybody, and a way of watching a doorway that never fully switched off. He'd ridden with a club back when clubs meant something harder than they mean now, worn a patch that made bar rooms go quiet. And then one winter, for reasons he never explained to a living soul, he'd hung the whole thing up, put the cut in a box, bought the shop, started opening at 7. And into that shop, 4 years back, walked a kid named Cody, 19 then, 23 now, who'd shown up on foot with a black eye and no jacket in November, asking if there was any work. Any at all. He'd sweep. He'd do anything. Deacon didn't ask where the black eye came from. He handed the kid a shop rag and a key and said, "Be here at 7." That was the whole hiring. The boy turned out sharp. Sharp the way kids get when they learned early that trusting the wrong grown-up costs you. And he learned every wrench in that shop, and Deacon never once raised his voice at him, not one time in 4 years, which the boy would tell you later was the strangest and best thing that had ever happened to him. Cody was the closest thing to a son Deacon had, and neither of them ever said that out loud, because men like that don't. Now, here's the piece that matters most, the piece that made the rest of it inevitable. Deacon's mother, Eleanor, had raised him alone after his father went down in a mill accident when Ray was 6, and she'd worked 2 jobs and never once let him see her cry. And when her mind started to go soft at the edges 3 years back and she couldn't be left alone anymore, Deacon did the hardest thing that quiet man ever did in his life. He put her somewhere. He chose Magnolia Grove because it was new and it was bright, and the brochure had a picture of an old woman laughing in a garden, and he paid what they asked, and he drove out every Sunday with a coffee made the way she liked it, cream and 2 sugars in a paper cup, and he sat with her, whether she knew him that day or not. He'd made her a promise the day he moved her in, standing in that little room with the flowered curtains, 1 word at a time so it would hold. He said, "Mama, nobody is ever going to hurt you again." And she'd patted his hand and said, "She knew, baby, she knew." Magnolia Grove had been a decent place once, when it was owned by the old doctor who built it. But the old doctor died, and the building got bought by a company, and the company got bought by a bigger company, and about 18 months before that dinner roll hit the floor, a young man named Bryce Halloran bought 9 of those homes on borrowed money and put his own name on every deed, and Magnolia Grove was the smallest and the last on his list of things to optimize. Bryce was 34, and he wore his suits like a credential, like proof of the thing he'd clawed his way out of, and he had a watch he turned around and around on his wrist when he was thinking about money, which was always. He had a smile that he used a great deal and that never once made it as far as his eyes. There was a wound in Bryce Halloran, a real one, and it's worth understanding even though it excuses nothing. His own father had been a doorman at a building full of people richer than he'd ever be, had spent 30 years saying yes sir and yes ma'am and holding the door and swallowing every small humiliation without ever once answering back, and had died with nothing. And Bryce had watched all of it and decided very young that he would be the one people said sir to, and that he would never, ever swallow anything again. So he built, he cut, he built on cutting. The numbers at Magnolia Grove were simple and cruel. Bryce had done the math and found that he could save $11 a day per resident by thinning the food, cutting a night aid, watering the staffing down below what the law wanted, and betting nobody would check. $11 a day. Across 90 residents, that was a real number to a man who thought in real numbers. And the fact that $11 a day was the difference between an old woman getting a second dinner roll and going to bed hungry was not a fact that appeared anywhere on his spreadsheet. The good aides quit or got fired. The food got thinner. The heat got turned down in the wings the family members never toured. And into that thinning came a girl named Maria, 22, a certified aide who'd taken the job because it was the only one that would have her, and who stayed long after she should have quit because she couldn't stand the thought of who'd be left with these people if she left too. Maria was the one who slipped Eleanor Coyle an extra roll wrapped in a napkin when she could. Maria was the one who noticed the old woman was losing weight. And Maria was the one who, in the weeks before the tray hit the floor, made the mistake of saying something. She caught Bryce in the hall on one of his walkthroughs, and she said, quiet, respectful, "Mr. Halloran, some of them aren't getting enough to eat. And I think Mrs. Coyle in particular. He looked at her the way you look at a smudge on a window. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Bryce learned that raising your voice is what you do when you don't have power. And he had power. He said, "You're an aide. You're not a dietitian. And if you can't do the job, I have 40 applications in a drawer. Turn the watch. Walk away." That was the first time. What he didn't count on, what men like that never count on, was that being told no by a girl who had nothing to lose and everything to protect is a different kind of dangerous than being told no by an equal. Maria didn't quit. She started writing things down. Dates, weights, meal counts. The night the heat failed in the East Wing and an old man named Walter got a chest cold that turned into pneumonia. She wrote it all in a spiral notebook she kept in her car. And she called the one number she could think of, the state elder care hotline. And a woman with 30 years on the job named Diane took the call and wrote a report and filed it and put one finger on it and told her supervisor, "This one's going to be bad. I can feel it. We should move fast on this one." And the report went into a queue behind 200 other reports, and the wheels of the state turned at the speed the wheels of the state turn. And while they turned, Bryce Halloran decided to make an example of somebody, so the rest of them would stop complaining. He picked the smallest, quietest woman in the dining room. He picked Eleanor Coyle. Now you know why I stopped the story at that tray on the floor. That's the part everybody wants to skip straight past, so let's slow down. Because you need to understand that when Deacon walked into that dining hall the next Sunday with a paper cup of coffee, cream, and 2 sugars, he did not yet know any of this. He came in the way he always came in, slow, unhurried, holding the door for an old man on a walker, and he found his mother's room empty, and a note taped to the door that said, "Residents relocated to Wing C." And he found his way to Wing C, the East Wing, which was colder than the rest of the building by a good 10 degrees. And he found his mother in a bed by a window that didn't close all the way. And she looked up at him, and for a moment she knew him. And she said, "Ray?" And then she said the thing that ended one man's whole world. She said, "Ray, I've been so hungry." Deacon Coyle set the paper cup down on the little table by her bed. Set it down slow. And he pulled the thin blanket up over his mother's shoulders. And he sat with her until she slept. And the whole time his face did not change at all. That's the thing about men who've already been to the far end of anger and come back from it. The face goes still. It's the stillness you want to be afraid of. He sat in that cold wing for a long time, and while he sat, he looked, the way a man looks when he has decided to remember every single thing. He looked at the window that didn't close all the way, and the strip of gray tape somebody had run along the bottom of it to keep the draft down. Tape that had been there long enough to go brittle and peel at the corner, which told him nobody with any power had walked into that room in a long time. He looked at the water glass on the little table, empty, a ring dried into the bottom of it. He looked at the tray by the door, dinner from the night before, a spoonful of something taken, and the rest gone cold and untouched. And he understood without being told that his mother hadn't left it because she was full. There was a man across the hall, coughing, the wet kind of cough that lives down in the chest and doesn't clear. And it went on, and nobody came. And Deacon counted the minutes between the coughing and the nobody coming, and the number he came to sat in him like a stone. He looked at his mother's hands, where they lay folded on the blanket, thinner than he remembered them. The wedding ring she'd worn 67 years turned loose on her finger now, loose enough that she'd wrapped a bit of thread around the band to keep it from sliding off. And that thread, that small, careful thread, was the thing that nearly took the stillness right off his face. because his mother had spent her whole life making do with less than she was owed, and never once complaining about it. And here she was at 84, doing it again, wrapping thread around a ring so she wouldn't lose the last thing her husband gave her, in a cold room, hungry, saying she was sorry to the men who did it to her. Deacon reached over, and he fixed the blanket where it had slipped off her shoulder, and he tucked it under, careful, the way you'd tuck in something that might break. And he sat back down in the hard chair, and he did not move for a long while. A nurse came by once, a young one, harried, an arm full of charts, and she saw him sitting there, and she slowed. And something in the set of that gray-haired man in the leather vest made her not ask him to leave, even though visiting hours in that wing were long over. And she just said, softly, "She has good days, your mom." And he looked up at her and said, quiet, "Does she get fed on the good days?" And the nurse didn't have an answer for that. And she looked at the floor, and she moved on down the hall, and the silence she left behind her had the sound of that man across the hall still coughing in it. That was when Deacon stood up. He stood up slow, the way he did everything, and he leaned down over his sleeping mother, and he said something to her too quiet for anyone to hear. One or two words, the kind of thing a son says to a mother when he has just made up his mind about something, and wants her to know it, even in her sleep. And here is a thing worth understanding about the man, because it's the whole hinge of what came after. Standing in that room, Ray Coyle was not angry the way you'd think. He'd been angry, real anger, the killing kind, more than once in his life, and he knew the shape of it. And this was not that. This was colder, and it was steadier, and it did not burn. And that was the dangerous part, because anger that burns eventually burns itself out, and a man can be waited out. What settled into Deacon Coyle in that cold wing was not a fire. It was a decision. And decisions don't burn out. He'd learned that a long time ago, in the life he'd folded up and put in a steel box in the back of his shop. The difference between the men who lost their tempers and the men who made up their minds. And he'd learned it well enough that he'd spent 40 years making sure he never had to make up his mind about anything like this ever again. He'd built a whole quiet life around never having to. Opening at 7, burning the coffee, handing a kid a shop rag and a key, and asking no questions. And in one sentence, 4 words, his mother had reached across all of that quiet and undone it. "Ray, I've been so hungry." Some men would tell you a thing like that breaks a man. It didn't break Deacon. It did something worse, from the point of view of a young man in a gray suit turning a watch around his wrist 2 floors up. It clarified him. It took a man who had spent 4 decades deliberately blurring the sharpest parts of himself, and it wiped the glass clean. And what was left standing in that cold room was exactly the thing the whole county had half forgotten was ever there. He didn't feel it as rage. He felt it as a kind of quiet, the way you feel the air go still and heavy before the sky opens up. That particular hush that isn't peace at all. That's the opposite of peace. That's the sky deciding. He looked once more at the tape on the window, and the empty glass, and the cold tray, and the thread wound around his mother's wedding ring, and he filed each one of them away somewhere permanent. And then he turned and walked out of that room into the hall, and the coughing man across the way had finally gone quiet, and the only sound in the whole wing was the hum of a heater vent pushing air that wasn't warm enough to matter, and the squeak of Deacon's own boots on a floor that hadn't been mopped in longer than it should have. He needed to know how deep it went before he did anything, Because a man who acts before he understands the whole shape of a thing ends up breaking the wrong part of it. And Deacon Coyle had never in his life broken the wrong part of anything. So he went looking for the one person in that building who he could already tell had been trying, in whatever small way she could, to hold a line nobody was paying her to hold. He found Maria in the hall. He found Maria in the hall. He didn't loom, he didn't demand. He just asked her, quiet, "How long has my mother been in this wing?" And something in how he asked it told the girl she could tell the truth. And she did. All of it. The rolls, the weights, the heat, the notebook, the report she'd filed. She started crying halfway through and apologized for crying, and he told her not to. And Cody, who'd driven out with him that day because the shop was closed on Sundays, stood in that cold hallway and watched the man he'd worked beside for 4 years listen to all of it, without saying a single word. And Cody, who was sharp, felt the temperature of the whole day change. When Maria got to the end, Deacon asked her one question. He said, "Does the owner ever come himself?" And she said, "Tomorrow. Mondays he does the walkthrough. He'll be here at 10. And Deacon nodded and thanked her, using her name, and told her to hold on to that notebook and not to lose it. And then he walked out to the parking lot and stood by his truck for a long moment in the cold. And he did not shout, and he did not put his fist through the window. And Cody would tell you later that was the most frightening thing he ever saw a man not do. Here's what most people would have done, and here's why Deacon didn't do it. Most men, finding out somebody had starved and humiliated their 84-year-old mother, would have been there Monday at 10 to meet Bryce Halloran in that parking lot. And it would have been fast, and it would have felt good for exactly as long as it took the police to arrive. And then, Bryce Halloran would have been a victim, and Deacon would have been a criminal, and the home would have gone right on starving old people, while its owner pressed charges from a hospital bed. Deacon had done fast in another life. He knew exactly what fast bought you and exactly what it cost. He'd made a promise to his mother, one word at a time, that nobody was ever going to hurt her again. And he was going to keep that promise. But he was going to keep it in a way that couldn't be undone, a way that took the whole rotten thing apart at the root so it could never grow back on some other old woman in some other cold wing. And to do that, he was going to have to pick up something he'd set down a long time ago and sworn he never would again. Not his fists, something older and heavier and far more dangerous to a man like Bryce Halloran. He was going to have to pick up the phone. Because here's the thing about the life Deacon Coyle had walked away from. When you leave a brotherhood the right way, with respect, having given more than you ever took, you don't stop being owed. The men he'd ridden with had scattered into other lives, become grandfathers and shop owners and long-haul drivers, and a couple of them lawyers, and one of them, the strangest turn of all, a sitting county commissioner 2 counties over. But every one of them, to the last man, would have crawled over broken glass if Deacon called. And Deacon had never once called in 40 years. That was the interest. That was what all those years of not asking had earned him. That night, in the shop, after Cody had gone home, Deacon went to the back room and moved a shelf of gaskets and pulled out a steel ammunition box, olive drab, dented. A box he'd checked was still there maybe once a year for 19 years, and never once opened in front of anybody. He opened it now. Inside was a folded patch, worn soft as cloth, and under the patch, wrapped in an oil rag, a small dark medal on a faded ribbon that the government had given him for a day in a jungle he never talked about. He didn't take either one out. He just looked at them for a while in the light of the one bulb. Then he closed the box, and he made his calls, quiet, one at a time, and to every man who answered he said close to the same thing. He said, "It's Deacon. I've never asked you for anything. I'm asking now." And then he told them about his mother, and about the dinner roll, and about the cold wing, and every man on the other end of that line went very quiet, and every one of them said the same word back. When? Monday at 10, Bryce Halloran pulled into the Magnolia Grove parking lot in a car worth more than the aides made in 3 years, turning his watch on his wrist, running his numbers. And he did not notice at first that there was a single motorcycle parked crossways across the entrance to the lot, and a gray-haired man in a leather vest sitting on it, not blocking anything really, just there. Deacon had not brought 60 men to that first meeting. That's not how you do it, and he knew how you do it. He'd come alone, on the bike he almost never rode anymore, wearing the cut he'd sworn he'd never wear again. And the sight of it, the old soft patch on the back of that vest, meant nothing at all to Bryce Halloran, who was 34 and had never in his life been in a room that went quiet. It meant something to the old maintenance man, Earl, sweeping the walk, who was 61 and had grown up in this county, and who saw that patch and stopped sweeping, and went the color of old paper, and went inside, and did not come back out. Deacon got off the bike slow, the way he did everything, and he walked up to Bryce Halloran in the parking lot, and he did not raise his voice. He said, "My mother is Eleanor Coyle." Bryce, who genuinely did not remember the woman whose tray he had thrown on the floor, arranged his face into the smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "And how can I help you, sir?" Deacon looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to give you one chance, and I'm only going to say it once, and I want you to hear it as a kindness, because it is one. Fix it. Feed them. Warm the wing. Keep the girl who spoke up, and double her pay. Make it right, all of it, and you'll never see me again, and this ends here in this parking lot this morning." It was a real offer. He meant every word of it. Deacon Coyle did not want a war. He wanted his mother warm and fed, and he wanted the thing that had done it made harmless. And if Bryce Halloran had been a different kind of man, that is exactly where this story would have ended, in a parking lot, with an old man getting back on a bike and riding home. But Bryce Halloran was the kind of man who mistook mercy for weakness, because in the world he'd built himself out of, that's all mercy had ever been. He turned the watch on his wrist. His smile flickered like a candle catching a draft it hadn't seen coming. And then he steadied it, and he said the words that took his whole world apart. He said, "I don't respond to threats from bikers in my parking lot. This is private property. You've got 2 minutes before I call the police and have you removed, old man." Old man. Deacon didn't answer that. He'd offered the one chance, and it had been refused, and something behind his eyes closed like a door. He got back on the bike. Before he rode off, he said one last thing, and he said it quiet, almost gentle, which is why it landed the way it did. He said, "You had that coming to you the honest way, and you turned it down. So now it comes the other way. And I want you to remember when it does, that I offered you a dinner roll, and you chose this." Then he rode off, and Bryce Halloran laughed and turned his watch and went inside to fire Maria, which he did before lunch, and he genuinely believed the whole thing was over. He was wrong. The worst week of his life hadn't introduced itself yet. Here's what happened in the 72 hours after Bryce Halloran called a 66-year-old man old man in a parking lot. It didn't start with fists. It started with paper, and paper is so much worse. That county commissioner 2 counties over, the one who used to ride, made 2 phone calls to 2 people who owed him, and the state elder care report that had been sitting in a queue behind 200 others, Diane's report, the one she'd put her finger on and said, "This one's going to be bad," got pulled to the top of the pile Tuesday morning. A surprise inspection got scheduled for Thursday. A lawyer who'd worn the same patch as Deacon 30 years back and now had an office with his name on the glass took a copy of Maria's spiral notebook and Maria's statement, and by Wednesday he had statements from 4 more aides and from 2 families, and from the daughter of the man named Walter who'd gotten pneumonia in the cold wing. And he filed all of it, neat, on time, by every rule. And Earl, the old maintenance man who'd gone the color of paper in the parking lot, the one who'd recognized the patch, Earl sat the other maintenance men and the 2 young aides down in the break room Tuesday and told them a story none of them had ever heard, about who that gray-haired man on the bike used to be, back before their time, and about the kind of men who used to go quiet when his road name came up. And one of the young ones laughed and said, "So what? He's like 70. And Earl looked at him and said the thing that made the whole break room go still. He said, "It was never about the one of him. It's about how many of them will come if he asks. And I don't know how many he can still call. And that's the part that ought to scare you. Because I can't promise you it's none." By Wednesday night, the story had left Magnolia Grove entirely and become a thing the whole county was passing around. And it had reached the investors who had put up the money for Bryce's 9 homes. And a very calm man in a very expensive office called Bryce and said the sentence that changed the temperature of Bryce Halloran's entire life. He said, "Why is there a state inspection, a lawsuit, and a reporter, all pointed at the smallest home in your portfolio, and all in 1 week?" And just like that, the whole shape of it changed for Bryce. This was no longer about $11 a day. It had stopped being a shakedown he could laugh off in a parking lot and become a fire he could not get in front of. And for the first time since he'd bought the patch of a suit off his own humiliation, Bryce Halloran was afraid. He did the thing frightened men who've never learned any better always do. He decided to make it worse. He figured this was a pressure play, that the old biker wanted money or wanted the home, and that if he could catch the man doing something ugly, trespassing, making threats, he could flip the whole thing, get a restraining order, make himself the victim on the reporter's page instead of the villain. So Bryce Halloran hired 3 men. Not a gang, 3 men off a website. Men who did security, or said they did. Men with more muscle than sense. And he told them to be at Magnolia Grove Thursday morning when the old man came for his Sunday visit. Moved to Thursday. And to provoke him, get him on camera doing something. And if it got physical, well, Bryce would have his victim. That's the tray on the floor you started with. That's the morning we opened on. Now you know how it got there. Thursday morning, 7 o'clock. Deacon opened the shop like he had for 19 years. He'd gotten word that the inspection was set for that day. He'd gotten word his mother had been quietly moved back to a warm room Wednesday night by an aide who'd defied Bryce to do it. He had every reason to believe the paper was going to do the work, and he'd never have to raise his voice at all. And he almost drove straight past Magnolia Grove that morning to let the state handle it. Almost. But he'd promised his mother he'd bring her a coffee, cream and 2 sugars, and Deacon Coyle had never in his life broken a small promise on the way to keeping a large one. So he made the coffee, and he drove out. And Cody rode along because Cody had started to understand that something was ending, and he did not want the old man to face the end of it alone. They walked into the dining hall at 10 of 9, and the 3 men Bryce had hired were already there, in the wrong clothes, watching the door. And one of them clocked the old man in the leather vest and the young kid beside him and figured this was the easiest money he'd ever made. And that's when it happened the way you heard it at the start. Except now, you can see the whole floor. One of them, the big one, walked down the length of that dining hall to Eleanor Coyle's table. And he took the dinner roll off her plate, and he dropped her whole tray on the ground, applesauce across her slippers. And he said it loud, the line about the contract, playing the part Bryce had cast him in, trying to make the old man across the room lose his temper on camera. And Eleanor folded her hands and said, "I'm sorry," to a room that would not stand up for her. Deacon Coyle set the paper coffee cup down on an empty table, set it down slow, and came around the end of the serving line the way he did everything, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world. The big man saw him coming and laughed. He stopped laughing about 4 seconds later. Deacon did not throw a punch in that dining hall. Understand that, because it's the whole point. He walked up to the man, and the man put a hand on his chest to shove him, on camera, exactly like Bryce wanted. And Deacon took that wrist and turned it, and the big man went down onto one knee among the applesauce and the plastic, not from a blow, from a wrist. And Deacon leaned down and said something to him too quiet for the phones to catch, and whatever it was, the big man's face changed, and the other 2, who had started forward, stopped where they were. 9 seconds, maybe 10. Nobody threw a punch. There was no fight to put on camera. Then Deacon let the wrist go and stood up, and the first thing he did, the very first thing, before he so much as looked at the 3 men, was crouch down by his mother's chair and check on her. He picked the dinner roll up off the floor and set it aside, and he said, "Mama, I've got you a fresh one in the truck." And he pulled a clean napkin from the dispenser and wiped the applesauce off her slippers himself, kneeling on that dining hall floor in front of 40 people. And only when she was settled and calm did he stand back up and turn around to deal with the 3 men Bryce had sent. And by then, they were already backing toward the door. Deacon looked at the 3 of them and he said, quiet, "You can tell the man who hired you that he had his chance in the parking lot." And then he said the thing that told the whole room this was bigger than 3 men. He said, "And you can tell him to look outside." Because while Deacon Coyle had been wiping his mother's slippers, the parking lot of Magnolia Grove Assisted Living had been filling up, not with a gang, with men. Motorcycles, yes, a great many of them, but also pickup trucks and 1 delivery van and a sedan with a county commissioner in it. And they came in slow, one after another, and they parked in every legal space and along the legal shoulder of the public road, and they shut their engines off, and they did not come inside, and they did not shout, and they did not so much as raise a fist. 62 of them. Grandfathers, most of them now. Veterans, a lot of them. Men who used to lower their voices when the road name Deacon came up. Every one of them had gotten 1 call, days before, from a man who'd never asked them for a thing in 40 years. And every one of them had come. And every one of them was doing, at that exact moment, the single most dangerous thing 62 men can do to an institution like the one Bryce Halloran had built. They were obeying the law perfectly, in numbers, in public, where everyone could see. They stood in the parking lot with their arms folded, and they were breaking nothing. And there was no crime to charge, and no threat to record, and nobody to remove. And they simply would not leave. And every family member who pulled in to visit that morning had to walk past 62 silent men to get to the front door, and had to ask, what happened here? And every one of them got told the truth. This was the alternate kind of war, the kind that doesn't leave a mark on anybody and cannot be undone. And it arrived at Magnolia Grove at the exact same hour as the state inspector, a woman named Diane, who had driven out herself, unannounced, deliberately not in a suit, and who walked through that lot of silent men and up to the door, and who found Deacon Coyle inside, standing over a spilled tray with his hand on his mother's shoulder. Diane had been doing her job for 30 years. She'd read Maria's report. She looked at the cold east wing on her clipboard, and she looked at the 91-pound woman in the cardigan, and she looked at the man standing over her, and she used a name almost nobody in that county remembered the old biker had, his legal name, out of respect. She said, "Mr. Coyle," and then she said, "I'm going to need to see the whole building, and I'm going to need to see the kitchen ledgers, and I'm going to be here all day." And somewhere in his office, watching 62 men fill his parking lot on the security monitor he'd installed to catch the old man committing a crime, Bryce Halloran turned his watch on his wrist so hard, the band broke. Here is where a lesser story would give you the fight you were promised. There wasn't one. That's the point of the whole thing. Bryce Halloran came down out of his office because he had to, because his investors were calling and the reporter was in the lot, and there was nothing left to do but face it. And he walked out his own front door into a parking lot of 62 silent old men. And not one of them touched him. Not one of them said a word to him. They just watched him, the way you watch a man carry something too heavy for him across a room. And the watching was worse than any beating anyone could have given him. He found Deacon by the bikes. He'd come out to do the only thing frightened men know how to do, which is talk. And he opened his mouth to threaten, to bluster, to reach for the restraining order that had turned to ash. And Deacon Coyle looked at him and spoke first, in the same quiet he'd used in the parking lot 3 days before. He said, "Nobody here is going to lay a hand on you. Look around. Every man here knows the law better than your lawyer does, because most of them learned it the hard way. Not one of them will give you what you were hoping for." And then Deacon told him what was actually going to happen, laid it out plain, one piece at a time, the way you'd read a man his own future off a page. He said, "The state's inside your building right now, and she's going to find every cold room and every thinned meal and every hour you cut. Because a girl you fired wrote all of it down. There's a lawsuit filed with your name on it, and 5 families behind it and more coming. There's a reporter in your lot. Your own investors have already decided you're the fire, and they're going to put you out by throwing you on the ground. And none of that, not one word of it, is me." That was all your own arithmetic. You could have fixed it for $11 a day. You chose this instead, over a dinner roll in front of my mother. And Bryce Halloran stood in that parking lot, and you could watch the math land on him in real time. Watch him run the numbers he was so good at running, and find that every single line came out against him, and there was no column left to move it to. His hands shook. He'd never crossed into a place he couldn't buy or bully his way out of, and he was in one now, and it had been built for him one lawful brick at a time, by a man he'd called old. Then the boy, Cody, the one who'd been swept up off the street 4 years back and never once shouted at, walked over and stood next to Deacon. And he was holding something in both hands, and it was the spiral notebook, Maria's notebook, the one Deacon had told her not to lose. And Cody held it up so Bryce could see it, and see that it was real, and that it had been copied, and that it was already too late to make it disappear. And Cody said the only words he said that whole morning. He said, "It's all in here, every day of it, and there's 3 more copies." It was a bluff about the copies, and it wasn't a bluff, because by then it didn't need to be true. It only needed to be believed. And Bryce believed it. And the weight of the whole thing finally won its argument with the last of his defiance. And his shoulders came down, slow, like something long held up finally being allowed to rest. It was over. Truly over this time. And nobody had thrown a single punch worth the name. The men left the way people leave a funeral.
Quiet, careful, one at a time, nobody looking back, engines starting up in a long, low roll that you could hear for a mile. And by noon, the parking lot was empty again, except for Diane's car, and the reporters, and Bryce Halloran's sedan with the broken watch band on the seat. What followed came fast, and it came by the book. The state inspection ran 3 days and filled 40 pages, and it found everything Maria had written down and a great deal she hadn't. And Magnolia Grove was cited on 11 counts. And 11 was the number, wasn't it? $11 a day come back around as 11 violations. And a temporary administrator was appointed, and the food came back that same week, and the heat came back on in the East Wing. And a girl named Maria got a phone call offering her old job back at double the pay, this time from the state, not from Bryce. And she took it. And the residents she'd worried about got a young woman who'd fought for them put back in charge of their care. The lawsuit that followed named Bryce Halloran personally, and what came after it was a long, accumulating list of consequences that ran to records subpoenaed and ledgers seized and sworn statements from 4 aides and 2 families and 1 old maintenance man named Earl, who'd gone the color of paper and decided which side of his own life he wanted to be standing on. And by the end of the month, his investors had called their notes and taken every one of those 9 homes away from him, and the state had barred him from operating an elder care facility in that state ever again. And the man who'd built himself out of his father's swallowed humiliations ended up with nothing, exactly the thing he'd sworn he'd never be. And there's a part of me that has to tell you the truth about that, because the man had a wound, and the wound was real. And I told you at the start I wouldn't pretend otherwise. He was not a monster. He was a frightened young man who'd been handed something too heavy and had picked the wrong way to carry it every single time he had a choice. And every choice was his, and choices have a price. And he paid the whole price. Somewhere in that, if there's any mercy in it, is the hope that he understood, finally, standing in that empty parking lot, the one distinction he'd spent his whole life refusing to see. That there's a difference between the people who say, "Sir," because you've earned it, and the people who say it because you frightened them. And that his father, holding that door for 30 years, had earned more respect in one shift than Bryce had frightened out of the whole world in a lifetime. Eleanor Coyle lived 2 more years in a warm room, well-fed, in a home that was watched now, and her son brought her a coffee, cream, and 2 sugars, every Sunday until the last one, whether she knew him that day or not. Cody stayed on at the shop, and the 2 of them never talked much about that Thursday, but something between them had settled into place permanently, in the way that never needs words to be real. And when Deacon Coyle passed, quiet, in his sleep, at 68, it was Cody who found the note that said the shop was his, and Cody who kept opening it at 7 every morning, because by then it was simply how the place ran. Half the county came to the funeral, and a great many of them arrived on motorcycles, and the whole town, which had spent decades not asking the old man about the life he'd folded up and put away, agreed, without ever saying so, to let it lie, because by then, everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who Deacon Coyle had been, and exactly who he'd chosen to become instead. And in the back room of the shop, behind a shelf of gaskets, the steel box is still there. Cody knows what's in it. He's never taken either one out.
He checked it once, the way you check a thing you'll never need, and closed it again. And it sits there, year after year, the folded patch and the dark little metal, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Now think back for a moment to where this whole thing started. A dining room, a tray on the floor, an old woman folding her hands and saying she was sorry to a room that wouldn't stand up. It looked, in that very first moment, like the oldest story there is, the strong taking from the weak, a man with power leaning on a woman with none, the world doing the thing the world too often does. But that's the thing about quiet men, and quiet is the word for it, because the loudest thing Deacon Coyle did in this entire story was start 62 engines in a parking lot and then shut them all off. The quiet was never weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made by a man who has already been everywhere violence can take a person, and looked at the far end of that road and decided on purpose to turn around and come back and open a shop at 7 o'clock instead. What Bryce Halloran saw in that parking lot was an old man on a bike he could call names. What he should have seen was a man who'd set down a very heavy thing a long time ago, and who would pick it up exactly once, for exactly the right reason. His mother, his word, a dinner roll, and would carry it just far enough to set the world right, and then set it down again for good, and go back to burning coffee on a hot plate. Power was never the metal in the box. It was never the patch. Power is who comes when you call, and how long you can go without ever needing to. If any of this landed on you, the part I'd actually sit with isn't the parking lot, because the parking lot's the least interesting part of the whole thing. It's the coffee. Cream and 2 sugars every Sunday, whether she knew him or not. That's the part that tells you who a man is. So let me ask you something, and I read every answer to these, every one. When Deacon stood in that lot and offered that man one chance to just feed them and warm the wing and be done, would you have taken it if you were Bryce? Or would your pride have done to you what it did to him? If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the men and women the world leans on until the day it finds out it never should have. If that's the kind of thing you want to sit with, stick around, stay a while. There's no rush. There's 2 more stories waiting for you right there on the screen, and I think either one will find you where you live. And to every one of you who cared enough about an 84-year-old woman and a dinner roll to make it all the way to the end of this with me, thank you. It means more than you know.